a number of factors driving incels. If we look at Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo and Rio pretty similar, but Rio has much more femicides, right? It's double. So we have the Maria da Penha law, but in the Northeast, who is implementing it?
Assine Valete Plus da ESPECTROCINZA ou morra na ignorância e você ganha uma revista.
Olá, sejam bem-vindos à primeira entrevista internacional do canal Espectro Cinza. Eu tô aqui com a pesquisadora e cientista Alice Evans, uma pessoa que eu admiro muito, muito mesmo. Eu acho que o trabalho dela é incrível, é uma super aventureira, tem uma grandiosíssima abertura e experiências, tem viajado o mundo inteiro para pesquisar sobre os mecanismos do patriarcado e como ele se estrutura ao longo do planeta, quais são as principais ou as mais relevantes questões que envolvem as dinâmicas entre homens e mulheres. O que despertou o seu interesse pelos estudos sobre gênero e desigualdade?
Thank you very much. So when I was 16, I traveled to South Africa and I saw a slum, and after I saw it I just started crying and crying and crying because I was so sad, right? To see so much poverty. And then after that I always wanted to work on human rights and inequality, and then later I studied gender.
Houve alguma experiência marcante que transformou sua perspectiva como pesquisadora?
Okay, so I think there are many experiences that always keep me questioning what I believed. I think as a researcher, it's so important to be open-minded to any possibility, right? So the best thing in the world is if I'm constantly wrong. If someone corrects me, if someone teaches me information that I didn't already know, then that's the greatest gift, right? I want to be wrong. I want to learn how to improve. So yes, there are many times where I'll think one thing and then I'll be like, oh no, actually it's more like this. So that is constant. I'm constantly wrong.
Na sua visão, quais fatores biológicos mais contribuem para as diferenças de comportamento entre homens e mulheres?
Okay, so I think the biggest biological differences are testosterone and reproduction. Males typically have testosterone, and that means that when they go through puberty, it sort of unlocks physical changes in their body. So men become much stronger. They're typically like 2.5 times women's upper body strength, like a stronger fist. You know, they can run faster, for example. Just an anecdote, you know, when my brother and I were little, we were just as fast, just as strong. And then when he goes through puberty, he's suddenly so much faster, so much stronger, so much taller. And so testosterone can elevate competitiveness, it can elevate zeal, it can elevate aggression. So that creates a distinct two particular things. One, if men have more testosterone, that can elevate the risk of aggression within relationships. A second issue that actually disadvantages men is that surging energy of testosterone, if it's not properly channeled, can send boys down the wrong path, right? So if you've got teenage boys surging with testosterone, then we want to make sure that they're in a supportive environment, like playing sports, rather than, you know, joining criminal gangs. So it was really wonderful. Yesterday in Santo André, we went to this amazing park by a low-income neighborhood that was really beautiful, really pretty, lots of lovely plants, and where boys could play basketball, right? So if you've got all that testosterone, it's great that the boys are playing basketball rather than doing something that's not so safe that could really hurt their futures. Okay, so then the other big difference is reproduction. So, like, if men and women have sex, there's a chance she could get pregnant. And in Brazil, we have a very high rate of teenage pregnancies, right? Especially in the Northeast, especially in the poorer communities. And this means that a girl is so disadvantaged because if she gets pregnant, then she has to pull out of school, and that really hurts her upward mobility, possibly trapping her in an abusive relationship. So here in Brazil, I've interviewed so many women who said, you know, they got pregnant at 14, 16, then they had to pull out of school, and then they're in much more precarious conditions. And if you're living in the favela with 2 children, it's very difficult to gain upward mobility. There are ways that we can tackle both testosterone and teenage pregnancy. So in the UK, in the US, in Europe, we have abortion so that women have an exit option. So the fact that in Brazil, abortion is still illegal means that women are very much trapped by their biology, right? But that's changeable with a sort of different political environment, with more feminist activism, with less sort of evangelical Catholic concern about the fetus, then that's changeable. So we can overcome our biological constraints, just as boys playing in the park or girls getting an abortion. But those are the biological constraints, and then it's up to society and up to the politics about how we deal with those different biological constraints.
Perfeito. Quais são hoje os principais desafios que afetam a vida dos homens e ainda recebem pouca atenção?
Right, so here in Brazil, the most disadvantaged boys really struggle with education, right? So 3 days ago, we went to a school next to a favela, and many of the teachers told me how the classrooms could be very disruptive, fights breaking out 3 times a week. So if you have 50 minutes of learning, there might actually only be 15 minutes of learning, right? So there's so many distractions, so many obstacles, and if boys don't progress in their education, if they're distracted by short-term goals like let me get a car, let me get a phone, something, if they're not thinking about the long term, then they don't go to higher education, they don't go to college. And here in Brazil, that's a big issue, right? Women are more likely to go to college than boys, and so then men are trapped in very informal work, precarious work that's at high risk of automation. And so this is a massive problem now in Brazil, that many of those low-skilled manual jobs have now been displaced, and it's a driver of inequality. So we really want to make sure that young men have skills so that they can gain secure employment in the labour market, because we found that a lot of research has shown that when men can't get status, then that creates this frustration in which they're unsatisfied, and that can cause backlash, etc. So we want to make sure that men can be supported and progress in education. There are a number of factors driving incels. So if we look at the data, the rate of coupling in Brazil and Latin America is going down. So more young people are staying single. And one possible cause for that is technology. So if everyone has their smartphone and they can watch hyper-engaging media, so here in Brazil a massive problem is, for example, sports bets, gambling, online gambling. So if people can entertain themselves watching their phones, playing games, video games, TikTok, etc., then they're less likely to go out and find a partner. Coupled with that, if they don't have much economically to offer, it's going to be much harder to find a partner. On top of that, if young women are becoming more progressive, then maybe men are not matching up to their expectations. So actually I think it's a growing phenomenon, not just in Brazil but worldwide, whereby young people are staying single and drifting apart. And that's, means less empathy, less understanding.
Quais estratégias têm se mostrado mais eficazes no combate à violência doméstica?
So if we look at gender attitudes, Latin America is approaching to be similar to Europe and the USA. It's not as patriarchal as places in the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia. But we see really high rates of violence. Also, within Latin America, some places may have very similar gender attitudes but very different rates of violence. So Chile actually scores as more patriarchal than Brazil, but their rate of domestic violence is much lower. If we look at Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo and Rio pretty similar, but Rio has much more femicides, right? It's double. The data is double. So why is that? So one of the drivers of intimate partner violence and femicides is certainly machismo. That they have authority, men react badly when women are insubordinate, women might be economically dependent, but another factor is a broader culture of violence. So in northern Brazil, for example, where it's a much more violent, machista society, then men learn to solve their problems with their fists, right? So we were just doing an interview with a family from the northeast, and they were saying, the father was constantly beating them. Even the boy was put on an ox when he was younger to toughen him up, to make him macho. And similarly in the favelas, if the state is not present, then boys have to act macho so other people will not attack them. And I hear that from so many young men from the peripheral areas, that if there is no rule of law, you have to act tough so that no one attacks you. So even in a Brazilian school, maybe you need to act tough so that no one attacks you. So what's really important in Brazil and Latin America is to enforce the rule of law, so that there is effective policing to ensure general security so that everyone is safe, because then men wouldn't need to learn to be macho. On top of that, we also need, strong feminist activism to ensure implementation of the laws. But a strong, effective state is super important. Lots of feminists, they think, the state is terrible. But I like to say, if the road has potholes, we don't say end the roads. We think build better roads. If the schools are bad, we don't say end the schools, we say build better schools. So if we don't like the police service, it's really important here in Brazil to build more accountability, to end the impunity, so that, the military police are much safer and much more respectful of human rights, while ensuring public security for all Brazilians. And then I think we'd see much lower rates of violence. So it's in the safer Latin American countries where you see much lower rates of femicide. So for example, Costa Rica, pretty conservative, no different from Brazil, much lower rates of domestic violence. I was there a month ago, right? No difference in attitudes, but it's just much safer for women. So if Brazil could be more like Costa Rica in terms of violence, women would be much safer.
Quais medidas tendem a ser ineficazes para combater a violência de gênero?
Right, so it's ineffective to have lots of laws on the books, but zero implementation, right? So we have the Maria da Penha law, but in the Northeast, who is implementing that? So even I was talking to the police and they say, that's not really implemented where the state is weak, where the state does not have control over territory, or maybe in some favelas where they're run by the PCC or other criminal gangs, right? What good is the law on the books?
Como que nós podemos interferir em mudar os critérios culturais que afetam a escolha das mulheres em se relacionar com homens mais agressivos? Em vez de elas escolherem homens agressivos, escolherem homens mais razoáveis, mais pacíficos.
Right, so that would be totally rational, right? So if I'm living in the Northeast where there are many murders and homicides and there's lots of danger, or if I'm living in a favela, I want a big tough guy to protect me. Like, I am not that strong, right? So I'd want a big tough guy. So that's very rational. The real issue is, how do you reduce the general violence? If there is no general violence, you don't need a macho guy, right? So the violence is the problem.
Perfect, é o que eu imaginava. Eu adorei. Em várias partes do mundo, as taxas de natalidade vêm caindo. O que fazer para resolver isso?
Right, so I think it would be great if people could get off their phones and start learning about each other. Right? So if you are always immersed on your phones and you don't actually have any female friends, then it's much harder to build empathy, understanding, to know what real women are like and to understand their perspective. And then it's much more likely that you'll be vulnerable to people who will say, oh, women are greedy, women are materialistic. So I think that friendship and understanding one another is like the building blocks of solidarity between people.
Será que em países mais desiguais, mais pobres, se relacionar com homens que têm mais capital financeiro faça mais sentido?
Right, so absolutely. So let's suppose you are a woman from a very poor favela and the schools are terrible, right? Here in Brazil, that's a major problem, quality of public schools. So it's very hard for you to gain upward mobility, right? How can you get a job? How can you progress in life? And so we see it right in Colombia, in Venezuela, women get plastic surgery, right? Because they're trying to attract a partner who can look after them. So absolutely, where the state does not invest in education and upward mobility and where there are not good jobs, a woman may recreate the sort of telenovela, right? The poor girl finding the rich guy. The telenovela happens in a context of income inequality and where women are sort of socialized to look to men for providers. There is definitely a lot of cultural differences around the world, but it's not just reducible to economics. So for example, I lived for 18 months in Zambia, I lived in a slum, I lived in a swamp, and there women can move independently. So they can wear, whatever they like, they can find their own partners, they can find their own boyfriends. And I could go to a state in India that is just as poor, perhaps even richer, and whereby women are closely chaperoned, they have to veil, they're not allowed to speak to boys. So it's not just about economics, but it's also about the culture and the restrictions on women.
A presença do Islã na Europa, ela é relevante para algum tipo de mudança cultural?
A cultural effect on the native population or cultural effect on the migrant population?
Talvez na cultura nativa já, pessoas com valores europeus e também em relação à queda de natalidade.
I don't think that the migrant population has a huge impact on the native population because the Muslims are often more segregated, right? In segregated community. I think the bigger issue is that where you have a persistent culture whereby male honor depends on female seclusion, then that can persist in Europe. So if we're concerned about women's equality and women joining the labour market and women joining political opportunities, then we might think, how can we support women's integration so that those migrants can thrive in Britain and France?
Eu tenho uma pergunta específica em relação a certos guetos que foram criados na Inglaterra, França, etc., que praticamente não existe integração e aparentemente mulheres nativas com valores europeus não podem circular lá com liberdade, sem usar véu, etc.
So I think the impact is more indirect. So for example, in Britain, only 37% of Muslim women work. Now, if people are not economically active, if they're not productive, then that creates a problem for our welfare state. So in Europe, we give benefits if you're unemployed, our healthcare is free, people have pensions. But if some people are not putting in, then that means that our welfare state is going to be strained. And so in communities where there is a high level of migrants, they might feel that there are tough economic conditions. So to make sure that we can celebrate migration and benefit from diversity and also maintain high economic growth and fiscal space for the welfare state, it's really important that we support women's economic integration. So it's not so much that it would be dangerous for women in those communities, but economically we need to help Muslim migrant women thrive economically.
Indique um livro ou autor que mudou profundamente a sua forma de pensar.
So in economics, there's a big literature called The Great Divergence. So this is all about how some countries got rich while others stayed poor. And so while I was reading that economics literature, including the book The Great Divergence, I was thinking, wow, but there's a parallel phenomenon for women, right? So in some countries they've become much more gender equal, and in some countries they're very patriarchal. Or in some countries like Brazil, they've become more gender equal in some ways, like culture, but still have a lot of femicides and violence. So it's like, wow, why is this? It's like the biggest question in the world, that why have some countries become so much better for women with so much more freedom and status and respect, and others are still very, very male dominated. So yes, it was that economics literature that made me think, what about culture? Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Adquira o curso de Lógica Argumentativa e aprenda como evitar frases ambíguas e vagas, como lidar com o verdadeiro e falso, como conectar bem as ideias, como organizar as ideias de modo claro, como estruturar bons argumentos, como analisar argumentos, como bons filósofos argumentam, como criar argumentos do zero. Usando o cupom ESPECTROCINZA, tu ganha 50% de desconto. Aproveita enquanto é tempo.